So first, I would like to thank our sponsors for supporting this forum. It's Cross Insurance, Pretty Flaherty, Vistage, and which is a new sponsor this morning, and I prefer to pronounce it so it sounds like it's French, and it's Vistage. Sounds much better. And also WinXNet. And with that, I would like to introduce Chris Claudio, who's the CEO of WinXNet, to give you a little bit about what his company does and why they're happy to support our venture this morning. So, Chris.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm glad you didn't start crying, because if you cried, I would have cried, and then my staff would have cried, and it would have been just a crying mess. But thank you for the introduction. We're happy to, I think this is our fourth sponsor of this event. This is a really cool event. I was on the panel for one of these, and this particular topic is near and dear to my heart because we have staff literally all over the world. We have employees in South Korea and as a technology company. We have staff in South Korea and Australia and Indiana and Tennessee and throughout New England. So this is a really cool thing, and I'm learning more and more about Maine and people that are moving to Maine and doing jobs like this. And we're actually, because of what we do, we provide outsourced IT and remote technology support for companies all over the world, frankly, is that we can bring staff here from pretty much anywhere and have them work in this fantastic state. So I know you're not here to listen to me, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa, and let's get going.
Thank you, Chris. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Whit Richardson, who's going to be the moderator of the panel this morning. And before I turn the microphone over, I just wanted to acknowledge the amazing series that Whit wrote for our newspapers that ran over the past 2 Sundays, Payday at the Mill. It really is a demonstration of the role that newspapers must play as a watchdog in our community, and we are so proud of that piece and the work that Whit and his editor, Carol Coltis, our business editor, did on that. So thank you, congratulations to you, and take it away.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. As you know, we're talking about remote work and kind of Maine's, the potential that that new workplace trend has for our state. So. And I think that we probably all know someone who lives and works here in Maine, but does so for a company that's based elsewhere. And before last year, I didn't think much of this fact. It was just kind of I knew people like that, but I didn't really put much thought into what that meant. And then the Portland Chamber last year in September released its economic scorecard, which showed Portland's employment was lagging, and which was surprising, since anecdotally I knew a lot of people that were finding jobs and were doing great work here. And I got a call from Michael Herald, who couldn't be here today because he's traveling. His wife is Misty, and she's also a remote worker, and they're a duo who've been very involved in this topic. And Michael called me and said, you know what, I don't think my job is counted in this report. I don't think other people like me are counted in this report when we talk about jobs. So that kind of got the ball rolling. I actually called Jim Demesis, who authored that report, and he admitted he didn't know. He himself is a remote worker, works for a company based in Saratoga Springs, New York, and he said, I wrote this report. I don't know if my job's counted in it, or if my job's counted in New York, or what, but he suspected that it was actually his job was counted in New York. So it goes to show we're missing an important subset of our workforce when we talk about jobs and the economic impact here. So we pulled together this panel to talk more about this issue, what it means for Maine. So I'll start to my direct left here. This is Jennifer Hutchins. She's the Executive Director of Creative Portland, which is a nonprofit organization founded in 2008 to support Portland's creative economy. She's on the boards of the Greater Portland Economic Development Corp. And the Greater Portland Convention and Visitors Bureau. She's, is here. We'll be able to talk about kind of the policy implications of this topic, and Jen will be able to speak to that. And to her left is Elliot Murphy. He's a software developer and a technology executive. He's had multiple jobs. He's currently the VP of Engineering at a San Francisco-based startup called Figly, but he is based here, and he's actually growing a development team here for a company out in the Bay Area. To his left is Misty McLaughlin. She is a digital strategist and a organizational development consultant with a software company called Jackson River, which is headquartered in DC. But she lives in South Portland and works here. And she is a member of the steering committee for the Work in Place Summit, which is we'll talk about more, but it's actually a group of people. Jen, you're involved in this as well, and I failed to mention that in her bio, but they're a group of people that are involved in trying to bring a national summit on this topic to Portland next year. And then to her left is Ryan Wallace. He is the project director of the Maine Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Southern Maine. He's actually a recent transplant, just moved up from Massachusetts. So we're happy to have him in the state.
We won't
now.
hold it against you. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
He's I don't remember if it was Ryan or if it was someone else, but basically said he's kind of the new Charlie Colgan.
I didn't say that.
Okay. Someone else told me that then.
Yes.
Never live that down.
And Ryan's actually working with Misty and Jen and the other members of the steering committee for this national summit on trying to put a finger on the numbers. Like, what's the size of Maine's, Portland's remote workforce? What's the economic impact? What's the future potential? So that's our panel. So let's just jump on in with some questions I have. I wanted to begin. What does it really mean when we're talking about this remote work? What does it mean to work in place? What are we actually talking about? I mean, I want to throw this to Misty, just straight off. From your point, what does it mean to, quote unquote, work in place, which is a term that her husband Michael coined, which I think is a great term. So what does it mean to work in place for you?
Well, so this came up actually when we started to talk about who these people are and how we don't really have a good name for them. As somebody said in the beginning, teleworker seems dated. Remote worker suggests that you are somehow doing work that is less than people who are centrally headquartered. And so we realized there was this sort of hole, like what do we call these people? And thinking about the notion of age in place, that people want to sort of be where they are and stay in the life that they have and go on with their life while they do other activities, that work in place is similar. It's the same kind of concept that, as Whit says, and so articulately, you sort of work where you live. You don't go to live where you work. And so that's where the kind of concept came from. It's a little bit different than something like freelancing or contracting. So when we say work in place, it's a pretty inclusive term, but we're specifically talking about people who do not go into a centralized office where all of their coworkers are every day, which increasingly is many of us, maybe even most of us, when you consider that organizations have disparate offices all over the globe, that people have clients who are not where they are, that a lot of work is happening remotely. People are working in place. They may telecommute 2 days a week. There are a lot of different arrangements that sort of fall under the work in place umbrella.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, I think one of the most interesting facts is that we don't really know what this population looks like. So, I mean, Ryan, can you give us a quick just overview of what we know, like how?
Sure.
How do we even begin to try to put a number on this?
Well, the short answer is there's not much data at all specifically on remote workers. And just to touch on the scorecard, now that Jim Demesis his group had been doing the scorecard, I'll let you know that CBER, Maine Center for Business and Economic Research, is working on the next release for this summer, and I will put the caveat out there that we're probably not going to have a measure of remote workers in it, but it is certainly something now that we've taken it on. We're gonna look to address this, and also as part of the bigger research project that we're working on. But in terms of the numbers, there's really a couple places where you can go for data, really economic data, secondary data that's publicly available. You have the American Census, and you have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which in coordination with the Maine Department of Labor release economic data. And there's some important differences in how that data is collected. And so the data that's used in the economic scorecard, for instance, is economic data from the Department of Labor by the state and also the federal. And that data is compiled from where companies report unemployment and insurance. So it's the company's home base where those jobs are counted. Okay, so in the case of Jim Demesis, he works out of Commute Associates, is based out of Saratoga Springs, New York. His job is likely counted in New York. It's not counted in Maine. So we look at the census data, American Community Survey is the primary resource. There's also another program I'll talk about in a second. But the American Community Survey is a survey-based, it's a home-based survey. So as we all get the census in the mail every 10 years, the census also goes out every year and does a sample. And basically on this survey, it asks the question, how did you commute to work? And one of the answers is, I work at home. Now, that could mean I work at home 1 day a week. That could mean I work at home every day of the week. So the data that's reported and the data that's really the best that we kind of have a rough estimate of who could potentially be a remote worker is this group that identifies as working from home. And so in Maine, that's about, I think, 2013, the estimate was somewhere around 5% of the workforce, so roughly around 36,000 people identified as working from home. We are able to break that down a little bit more to the types of work that people do. Most of those occupations are, well, we can at least account for about half of those are identified as self-employed. So depending on how we define remote workers, those may or may not be. Go ahead.
And it probably wouldn't pick up people that say work at think tank
Exactly.
or other co-working spots, or even people that have small offices here in Portland for a company based elsewhere.
Be interesting now how
Right.
Elliot.
Like Elliot, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, a long explanation for a short answer is that we don't have a lot of data on this. But what we're looking to do is the only way to really get at this is to do a large survey of the population and to derive some,
Sure.
in economic, statistically significant data.
And I think I just think it's a fascinating topic. And I was talking about this on Facebook, actually, and a friend directed my attention to an interview that now Senator Angus King gave to the Maine Policy Review in 2006. And I wanted to just quote this. This is 2006, so it's because this trend has really been happening really because of technology. I mean, you couldn't live in Maine and work for a company based in Texas or D.C. In the year 2000 almost. I mean, it would be virtually impossible. I mean, there were salespeople and that sort of thing, but you know what I mean. But anyway, so in 2006, Senator King said, "I think we have to think about where Maine fits in the world in which geography is no longer a significant barrier to economic development. And I think we are in a great place because it is a great place to live. It used to be you got your job and you hoped where you were was a good place. Now you can go to a good place and bring your job in with you. We're not fully appreciating what a radical change that is in human history." And I think that puts it very well. And I wonder, throw it out to Jen, how big an opportunity is this for Maine? Like, what is the potential that we have as a state to capitalize on this growing trend?
Well, the honest and short answer is we don't exactly know because we don't have a lot of data. But Creative Portland has been working on the broader issue of attracting talent to the Portland region since 2008. And the whole concept behind the creative economy as coined by Richard Florida back in the 1990s was exactly the point that Senator King made, which is thanks to technology, more and more people are able to choose where they live and work. And what ended up happening out of that is people started saying, so then it becomes a quality of life issue that, well, Maine is going to thrive because we have this great quality of life. And in the economic development field that I work in, up until recently, quality of life has sort of been the stepchild to all the other ways that regions promote themselves as a great place to start a business. Because people sort of say, well, yeah, it's nice to be next to the ocean, but come on, is that really going to change the economy? What I think is really exciting about understanding this segment better is that it's not simply about aesthetics. It's actually about business choices. What the potential is for the economic development field to understanding this cohort better is getting it out of the, Elliot and Misty decided to come to Portland, Maine because who wouldn't live in Portland, Maine, right? It's such a great place. It takes it beyond that conversation and into the Chris Claudio level conversation where he's trying to grow a company and he's trying to access brains and he's trying to access intellectual capital. And for him, it's a business decision in terms of being in Maine. It's not just a quality of life issue. So the potential in terms of understanding this group better is, for me as an economic development working in that field, is figuring out the strategies that we can use to make it easier and make it a better place for both Chris to do what he needs to do to grow his company, as well as encourage more people like Misty and Elliot to move here and invest in the community by raising their families here. The other point I just want to make is that the potential, you start thinking about it. One of the things, just a couple of examples in uncovering it, there's the story about the person who works at Home Depot who lives on Peaks Island, and she's the buyer nationally for Home Depot. Nobody knows that. There's also the story that it turns out there are some number of IBM employees that didn't even know they all worked in Maine. That's pretty incredible, right? Well, I start thinking about, what are the implications from a philanthropic standpoint? Right now, you don't even think about going to IBM for support for community issues because you think of IBM as being based someplace else. Well, why wouldn't those employees want investments made in the communities where they live? The social capital implications of this become really enormous as well. I'll stop there, but that's the point of having this national summit, is there doesn't seem to be anybody having that level of conversation about this topic yet.
Sure. And Elliot, I wanted to throw a question to you. I mean, I know that you've had several jobs where you've lived one place. Elliot used to live in Florida and worked for a company based in London, if I'm correct. So you've done this for several years now. When you were recently on the search for a new opportunity, why was it so important for you to find an employer that would allow you to stay living and working in Portland?
So it's interesting, we started talking about terminology. For me, the term I've used for about 10 years is distributed teams. And I really value working as part of a distributed team. Jennifer talked about access to talent and brains. When we decided to move here, we did a nationwide search for where our family was going to live. And we decided this fit for a whole bunch of reasons, and wanted to settle here. But so when I was looking for the next thing to do, I knew I needed to do something where I was building a team, and so it becomes really important to only talk with companies who are sort of set up from the beginning to embrace distributed teams. This idea of having a remote person or some remote people or getting permission really is a less than situation. But when you talk about a distributed team, that is when everyone's on a level playing field. The communication channels inside the company really, really work. And you get access not just to the technical talent, but also to a variety of lived experiences from around the nation and around the world. And that type of work environment is where I feel like I can do my very best work.
Misty, would you like to add to this? I mean, what is the benefit for you from this flexible work arrangement?
Yeah, there are so many benefits. I embarked on this in 2007. I'd only worked in offices before, and we sort of thought it's a remote experiment. My husband had been a writer and had been working from home, but it was my first go. So we moved to Maine. I went remote. I had no idea what I would think. And I found that I was about 2 times more productive than I was in the office. I had to hone some skills to figure out how to work with people in a distributed fashion. I also love the term distributed because what it ended up doing was sort of changing the way that people work together. People were much more conscious about the way that they were communicating because we were using digital channels and because we were on the phone and you missed body language. So I actually found that I liked the way that work happened much more, that people were much more intentional about the dynamics that they cultivated when they were working out of an office and trying to work together. So there was that, and then I had a baby here and found that I could balance the needs of my family with the needs of my work much better. So I didn't have a commute that I had to deal with every day in either direction. I could stop doing something to do a load of laundry and run back. which is, of course, a stereotype of a work-from-home person, that they're not on the job. But in fact, I wasn't having to do a lot of the things that you have to do, have 2-hour absences for parent-teacher conferences in the middle of the day, that fit. And then if I needed to do an extra hour of work from home in the evening, provided that I could sort of keep the boundaries, which is a skill you have to cultivate, I could do that very well. And so I found that I was much more productive, and I was able to get my work done in a much quicker time. So I love it. I'll never go back if I can help it.
And so I think when we talk about fostering an environment that allows this to happen, I mean, like, Elliot, I'm sure you need high-speed internet, right? You need, what else do you need? And Misty too. Like, what are the necessary ports? Like an airport close by, right? High-speed internet. What else?
Yeah, so you need basic infrastructure, but what all that really is about a sense of place. And that's one of the things I love about Maine is there's such a strong identity and sense of place here. There's this concept that's talked about a lot. I don't know who first came up with it, but I read about it from Christopher Alexander, the architect, of a third place. So you have like an office or where you do work, and you have your home, and then there's this third place where it's sort of in between, and where status, like because of your position in the workplace or because of your financial situation, like that doesn't really exist there. It's much more of a level playing field. And when I was searching for a place to live and ultimately work, I was looking for a place that really had that sense of place, because I was going to be working with people all over the world who had very different cultures and experiences, but I needed like a very high walk score. Like I wanted to walk because my physical health was important, and I could see like the more I sat in an office, every year it was going a little bit down, a little bit down. I needed like a healthy environment for my daughter. I wanted access to the ocean. I promised myself I'm always going to live near the ocean. You know, my daughter wanted seasons, like all of these little things. We wanted to have some cultural things around, and so like all of that just happened to be condensed right here. I know other people who've chosen to pick everybody up and move to Thailand, to move to Texas. It's just it's going to depend a little bit on your family, but I think what all of us are looking for is a sense of place and a community to be a part of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are two things that I would say would make this a lot easier over the long term to be able to kind of continue to do this kind of work at a personal level, but also in terms of that sense of place. And one of them is to know that I'm not going to be locked out of a career over the long term, that I'm still going to have job opportunities, whether those are in Maine, whether there's a pivot to something that's local work, or whether it's an entire career of remote work in place arrangements. I think that for my family, that's the biggest concern, that we got here that way, and we don't necessarily know that we're going to be able to stay here that way.
Mm-hmm. That's actually, I'd like to pick up on that, if it's all right.
Yeah, of course.
That's the other aspect of this that's really interesting is because it's quite clear that what many growing companies in this region face is access to talent. And so we're working on this issue of attracting skilled professionals to this region, but there are two key, we've gotten together recruiters from major companies from around the region, and there are several things that they face, but two of some of the top things that they share are the dual career issue, because so many couples both have careers, so you might be recruited by a company to come to Maine, but what's the other person going to do? And then this concept of career fluidity. It's great that I'm getting recruited by a big company in Maine, but I don't know that there are any other companies up there, so what if it doesn't work out? And we know that the modern worker is tending to spend just 5 years at their particular position rather than the former traditional 20 years into retirement. And so for me, when I look at the potential for understanding this population better, is providing more options for people like that. And when we first started going down this path and I started talking to some of the local company recruiters, at first just intuitively I thought, well, they're not going to care, right? Because we're really talking about the companies that are based someplace else and we want their workers. And when I started talking to the companies that are here, they said, oh no, we completely care, because of, in large part because of that issue. Because what they run up against is, yeah, you're offering me a really sweet deal, but that's going to get me here? Is that going to keep me here? And one thing we do know is that once people get here to Portland, they don't want to leave. Like there are people who have said they can't handle the winters, but get over it. Boston was worse this year. But at the same time, so anyway, I'm really excited about Portland, Maine, through this national summit, potentially becoming a national leader in having these conversations, because I just see that what we can gain from this and starting to address some of the other talent challenges that our business community faces. For me, the potential seems enormous, but I need to start asking those questions because I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing about that?
Sure.
I have been thinking about this, of course, from the perspective of my population, where we've come from elsewhere and we're trying to figure out how to stay in Maine. But Maine has this big question of how do we keep people here, right? Like people from here, born here. What if you had the world of economic opportunity available to you and you didn't have to leave your state? And so I think that this is not just a question for populations from away, it's a question for Maine.
That's a good point.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just to add to that really quickly, I think one of the most important things an employer who may currently see themselves as being based in Maine can do to attract talent is to stop making living in Maine a requirement. That's looking at it exactly the wrong way. Like, I will never work for one of the companies based in Maine who may have an attractive opportunity if they're positioning themselves as, this is a job in Maine. I want the freedom to pick up and go somewhere for 3 months. And so like the best thing you can do is to stop trying to hire people in Maine, hire people wherever they are. And a lot of people will end up coming because of that.
Sure. I think that there was a comment, I can't remember his name, in the article that Ed and I wrote last week about just that fact that it's kind of crazy to think that your best potential employees are, within a couple miles of you, right? So it's both a question from employee point of view, but also employer point of view. There's a lot of things that are still being worked out, so this national summit could really start putting Portland on the map for that.
And Misty does such a good job of talking about how it really is going to require, and what Elliot's pointing out is that there are companies, there probably newer ones I'm surmising, that are understanding this idea of distributed team. It's not about hiring somebody who happens to work in a different state. It's about having a team of people who happen to live in completely different places, and they all come to the project as equals. But Misty talks about changing the culture, and that's the other aspect of this is really interesting to me, and Elliot was talking about this too, is what does it do for a company to change this idea of censoring themselves based on where somebody works, and the employee censoring themselves, like, I'm not even going to bother to apply. Why would they hire me? And vice versa. Well, gosh, their resume says they live in, such and such a place. And again, talking to some recruiters, they said, yeah, you're right. It would free me up so much if it wasn't a cultural impediment from the get-go.
Absolutely. I work for a totally virtual company now. But previously, when I moved here, I worked for a giant multinational software corporation that was headquartered in Austin and then Charleston, and I was just off their map. I was a remote worker, whereas now I am part of a virtual team. And it sounds like a semantic difference. It's completely different. Everything that we do is organized around the fact that we're not face-to-face, and it's fine. There are some people that can't succeed in those environments. There are people who don't work well, but the vast majority of workers, once they adapt, really, really like that situation.
One more question, then I want to open it up to the audience and have more conversation. But so right now, as we talk about the potential here, are, say the city or the state doing enough or anything to try to, encourage this sort of, to try to do anything to go after this potential? And if not, what should they be doing? And I think Jen can talk about that. But
what a lead-in.
Everyone can grab that.
Well, pull up a chair, everybody. I'm just kidding, Travis. He said state and city, so. Actually, I actually was going to ask Ryan to talk a little bit about the research project that we are proposing, and both the Department of Economic and Community Development, the state level, and the City of Portland have already put funds into supporting this concept of a national summit. So I will give both the State Department of Economic Development completely gets that it has potential and is supportive of our efforts. I think, admittedly, their brains aren't around it yet because there just isn't enough information. And the city too. But I shout out to both for giving us some initial support to try to investigate this. And Ryan can talk for a second about the research project that we're putting before MTI to understand this a little better.
Yeah, that's, excuse me, the gist of it is that we don't have the data. Policymakers, for better or for worse, need data to make decisions, and if it's not on their map, they're not going to do anything about it. So I think what Misty, Jen, Michael, and Whit, and others have really started to bring this conversation to the mainstream. So, as far as the study, what we're looking to do is get some funding to basically count the number of remote workers in the state. And then to understand some, basic demographic characteristics, why they make those decisions, why they chose Maine, how this arrangement came about. So ultimately, we'd like to get this completed before the summit next year to have something to talk about. But ultimately, this is, coming from sort of an academic background, this is not something that's really discussed a lot in the academic literature. This is a new sort of thing that folks are talking about. So this, I think, has the potential to kind of, once established, a pilot study in Maine to really be something that could potentially be applied nationally. So,
Go ahead.
Could I just survey the audience? Would you raise your hand if you would say that you work in place, if you're one of this population? All right, so about half of the audience.
well, right, exactly. And so, and to go
Okay,
with
we're
that,
done.
Yeah. So we can surmise that
Just,
50%
if you
of
could
our
just write
population.
down on your card how much you make and why you live in Maine, we'll be done.
well, right. After Whit and Ed's piece last week, I had received numerous emails from remote workers just coming forward, offering information, offering to help to be a part of this survey, and I was quite blown away. It's people. Remote workers, I would assume, are excited about this because they're finally say, "Hey, we're here. Bring us into the mix. We're contributing." And so I think hopefully getting this study underway and being able to get a solid number, we're going to have great from the feeling I get, we're going to have great participation from remote workers. So hopefully we'll be able to get a good sense next year.
Yeah.
So there's all the infrastructure stuff that's kind of just implicitly understood, I think, parks, sidewalks, internet. One of the things that made Portland stand out for me, and that I think other cities in Maine could benefit a lot from investing a little bit in, and one of the ways that Portland stood out from many other major cities, New Orleans, all kinds of other places that are much bigger, is co-working spaces, right? So we talked about this isolation issue of like where all of us are doing this work, but we don't really know how many other people, even at the same company like IBM, are here. I have benefited so much from being in a number of different co-working spaces in Portland. And the thing I worry about is like all of the people who are doing remote work now or distributed teams now are experienced. They're mid-career or later. Mm-hmm. And so I worry a lot about how do you bring in an apprentice or someone brand new, the next generation of talent. And I think the answer to that, you were mentioning some people really don't like the isolation. The answer to that, for me, is hire senior people wherever they are, and then in every single one of those villages or communities or whatever, establish a little tiny co-working space and have some new people come in there, have everybody hire where they are, and like develop the people around them in their community. Mm-hmm. And that like will cause such an explosion of new talent and like new job opportunities as these people start companies together and jump back and forth between the different companies. And Like,
Yeah.
that's the thing I would like to see, every single town having a co-working space.
Right. And it's certainly an issue. I mean, we talk about Portland because we're here, but I mean, there's plenty of communities throughout Maine where there are remote workers, and I know that
And empty buildings.
and empty buildings, right? And I know Pat Roche is here, who's the guy who started Think Tank, and I know that he's started one in Yarmouth, and he's trying to start one in Biddeford, I think. There's also a bill in front of the legislature right now to try to create a fund that would provide funds to communities that want to start co-working spaces. So there was a public hearing yesterday. And so let's open it up to questions. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Let's go. Pat, you want to say something?
Yeah, less of a question, but just an announcement. It's LD 1332, and it's before the legislature, and it's an act to attract entrepreneurs to the state, and it's a $250,000 fund that can be essentially allocated in a given year in $25,000 increments to people who want to open a co-working space wherever they may be. So it goes for small communities, rural communities, as well as urban places. It can possibly apply to people like myself who want to expand my brand, but also individuals who just want to create a sense of place for remote workers wherever they are. So it does need some support. I testified yesterday up in Augusta, and I was kind of surprised at actually how much pushback we got from some of the senators on the panel, considering it seemed like a no-brainer. It's like, oh, it's small money, and it's a great way to kind of foster the small business economy. But in any way, in any of your capacities, feel free to write to Justin Alfond, who introduced the legislation, or anyone else who you think might be, an advocate for this. It's LD 1332.
Excellent.
Sure, John. I think that this issue of how you find these people and how you conduct this survey is fascinating to me because, like most of us, I guess, we know of workers in place anecdotally. The person next door, or somebody sends you an email, or you find out about someone on Peaks Island. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It seems to me that if your goal is by next summer, when you have this summit ideally, to have some data in place, that in a relatively tight community like this, you could, by all of our respective networks, have some central database that we feed names into and say, all I know is that this person is a remote worker, then it's someone else's job to add them to some list and to figure out what to say. But I suspect that over a few months, you could gather a lot, and I also would rely on the neighborhood associations. I live in Back Cove, and it's through the neighborhood association that I'm aware that 2 blocks over there are several people who work for Bank of America who happen to live on that street. So it's not, the people we're talking about tend not to belong to civic organizations or show up necessarily at Green Jinx or 2 Degrees or something like that. They work out of home and they're uninvolved or unengaged to some degree. So we have to reach out and find them. But I think that that process could be done somewhat communally, and you could build up a really significant database in a not long period of time.
In addition to social support, which I think is an important point, that last summer at the Maine Startup and Create Week, we did a panel called Live Locally, Work Globally, and I asked the audience, how many of you, exactly the same question, how many of you are work in placers in Portland, Greater Portland? Most of the audience raised their hand, and I asked people, how many of you would like some social support for working from home, for working from co-working spaces, from how you get your work done, how you meet people and plug in, and everyone raised their hand. So if in fact you would also like some social support around this, I think maybe there's some kind of organizing that we could do. That's a possibility in addition to the data collection.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks for the comment. I mean, there's a couple of ways we're trying to go with this. One would be sort of a much bigger, more expensive study, a traditional kind of a census type survey. But then there's also, which is likely how we might go about this, is sort of a more of a networking type of survey and getting absolute counts of people. So, and judging from, again, by the interest and the people that have come out and offer information, I think that we likely could get a pretty good idea, good sense of who's out there and where.
It's just worth saying, though, that there's certain amounts of things in terms of understanding the percentage of the population that is like this wouldn't be captured. So we're just trying to weigh the methodology with the intended data that we want to collect.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sure.
I can make 3 quick points, 2 of which respond to the comments that Misty made. For years, I was managing an international team out of an office near Boston. by the time I got in and read the email from Amsterdam, I was responding at like 10 a.m., which is the end of the workday. So we got one round trip. I got permission to work at home 4 days a week. I get up early. I'm sitting with my morning coffee, reading the email at 5 a.m., responding. That's early afternoon in Amsterdam. We had 2 round trips. So there was in the international environment, there was a new productivity. But for a number of years, I was a consultant helping companies set up what were then called telecommuting programs. And there were 2 points that speak to what Misty said. The predominant method of management was management by proximity. If I see you in your cubicle, I assume that you're productive. I don't know what's going on with you and your teenage kids and your wife and that boat that you want to be on.
Right.
And we really needed to train managers how to contract with their workers and establish effective communication channels. And then for workers, there were 2 key issues that they needed to learn. One was how to spotlight themselves. Misty said she doesn't want to be dead-ended and left out on a rural road in Maine. What could she do that would make her more visible across the board, not just in the narrow reporting channels, but more broadly? And, and how do we replace the water cooler conversations? They're not need to know. Top management may feel they're not that important, but they're very important. And I wonder what could be done in Maine to help train on both sides. And for a remote worker or work-in-place person here, they may need to help train their manager. How can you best manage me so that you are clear that I'm productive, so that I'm getting the feedback I need to be productive in the most effective way, and so that I'm aware of the rest of the team and the rest of the team is aware of me? And I would suggest that that's a productive question to look at. What could we do that could improve the situation of work-in-place people so it becomes more attractive and people can feel more secure working in that environment?
Sure.
So on the water cooler thing, that's why I like co-working spaces so much, because there we can all sort of gripe about the weather, and where the people who are distributed, right, are having a totally different experience. Like, oh, it's summertime here. It's, that's not happening. The weather's totally different. So there's a little bit there, but for most of the workplace water cooler stuff, it's a totally solved problem with chat rooms. So I am currently in 7 different Slack organizations, and they're free to set up, and they're amazing. These little communities are springing up everywhere. Before Slack, it was all happening on IRC, which was sort of a technical barrier, but Slack is so easy to use. Every single distributed team that I go into, you set up Slack, and people can connect from their phone, from their web browser, from their desktop, and just
People may not know what Slack is. What's Slack?
So it's a virtual chat program, right? So there's rooms, and you can have one that's like deliberately for random conversation. You can have one that's for breaking news stories or some other thing that's specific to your organization. So like for us, we write a lot of software, so we have an operations channel. If anything goes down, like all the coordination, command and control coordination happens there. It's completely replaced email and phone for 90% of our communication.
Right. It's not just for chat rooms of disparate people, but it's also for organizing a team and communication, and so it's quite cool. Though I haven't used it, I want to. Anyone else have any comments based on that question? Or sure. Over there.
My comments are something a little bit different. Actually, I've been working remotely or telecommuting or whatever you want to call it for about 35 years. But I'd like to point out some of I'd like to point out what I think are some of the advantages to everybody of us being part of the Maine community. Since most of our incomes are probably considerably higher than the Maine average of $48,000 a year, we contribute tax dollars that are far greater than the Maine average. To put it in business terms, we're profit centers for the state. Mm-hmm. And I think and we reduce other people's tax burdens. And I think that's a wonderful thing. For those of us like me, who are at least semi-retired, I'm also, aside from working a good bit, I do expert work for large law firms. None of my work's in Maine, incidentally. Mm-hmm. I'm involved in other things like STEM development, professional society activities, things of that nature. Another advantage we bring is that a lot of us are from away, and we bring to Maine and to the community a cross-fertilization. It's kind of like spreading Scott's fertilizer on your lawn in the spring. And we can work from anywhere. I know people, a professional like myself was up in Greenville, another one down in Ellsworth. We're green. We don't pollute. In short, as far as I'm concerned, we're an economic development area that Maine should encourage.
Absolutely.
And you won't run into problems like we ran into up in Millinocket. That you, I appreciate your reporting on it. So why am I here, though? I like it here, plain and simple. I expect most people here will say the same thing. On the other hand, if I were to base where I live and work on a sound business decision, meaning dollars and cents, like an accountant, I'm an engineer, not an accountant, I wouldn't be here. The numbers don't make sense. But I like it here. Thus, my conclusion is that it may well be easier and less costly for Maine to attract 100 people like us to the state than it would be to attract a business that will employ 100 people.
Yep.
And we'd make more money at it at the same time.
Can I give you my
Thank you.
card, sir, before like a spokesperson for Greater Portland?
Great.
Hi. So my husband is currently commuting 4 days a week on the Downeaster down to Boston, which is awful. And we're looking for options for him to work in Maine. The problem that we keep coming up against is that the companies that he's talking to don't have anyone else who works here. So they have to, in addition to hiring him, hire another accountant. And we've gotten to the point in several discussions where they say, well, let's see if we can pay you, and then they can't really get there. Is that a problem that you're hearing? Do you have suggestions on how we could help them with this?
And so, to be clear, they need to hire another accountant because
it's very hard to get the paperwork done and to figure out what the business implications are for being able to have workers in a new place. Once you get it done, it's a one-time level of investment. But I have seen this as a barrier in organizations again and again. They're just like, I give up. I can't figure out how to work with Maine or Alabama or wherever people want to go. It's business intensive. And so in terms of what Maine could do, they could make it easy. They could give organizations tools and support. I mean, again, this is a one-time investment for us. We have to be able to make it easy for organizations to say yes.
And haven't we already discovered through some of the emails, which I shared with Senator King's office, is this idea that, and Ryan, maybe you can explain that a little more. There are actually regulatory barriers that make it difficult for people to do like what you and your husband are trying to do. Am I correct, Ryan?
I would say so. It's not. I haven't done a lot of looking at different, the state laws, particularly in Maine. But I have seen that states vary across the country, and so there's different challenges from state to state. Certainly, understanding what those challenges for businesses, to have employees in Maine, it would be a good idea for us to figure that out, what those are and how to change those things.
But to help, actually, but do you have any suggestions for her specifically besides the accountant one?
I don't off the top of my head. No, I'm
right.
So this is not a problem that's unique to Maine or to Massachusetts. The accountants who say it's too hard are being lazy, and their businesses are ultimately doomed. This is a problem like for hiring skilled people in Russia, in Argentina, everywhere. Like the things that I could tell you about how we had to get money to people in suitcases. The regulatory burdens between Massachusetts and Maine is not a problem. Now, that company might be saying that it's a problem. So that just means that they're not a viable option, right? So there are a couple of practical things that you can do is to dramatically increase the net for like your job search, right? Not just national, but international. The other thing that you can do is to start a small company, and just present yourself as a company. If you already have the relationships and they're wanting to hire you, then just look at how you structure that business relationship. You can have a company and have working conditions that are still very favorable. In fact, I think having a company can give you much more favorable working conditions because they're not allowed to enforce ridiculous policies on you about where and how you work. That is the definition of a consulting agreement. The third thing that you can do is to come to the meetups in Boston, but also in Portland, in Portsmouth, and get active in those groups. Every single one of them, every single person you meet there will have 5 other companies they can tell you about. Oh, I heard about this good place. They're friendly to remote workers, and you can absolutely find. I think my recent job search, I had to go through over 100 companies. You only need one to work. So you just have to cast your net much, much broader. And it is like absolutely a job. Like I worked at it full time for a few weeks in order to find a job. And so I'm very sympathetic to how hard it can be like during the search process, but then you can find it and you will get so many connections from that, then the next one gets easier and easier.
Right. And I know you've been hiring recently yourself, so you've gone through this from
Yeah,
people
I
in other
just
states
hired 4 people in the last 2 weeks, and one of the things that helped sell every single one of them was like, you're here now, that's great, but you can live anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Sure. I hope that helped. That sounded like good advice to me.
Green drinks, but also if there's anything that's industry specific, I don't know what type of work he does, but yeah, so anything industry specific, and you can also do this thing, like there tends to be like these groups of people that organize around technologies, but then also groups of people that organize around particular areas of business, and make sure you're going to both, and like making the connections between those two, and it can be done.
And Patro Trade, 2 rows in front of you, the guy that spoke earlier, he knows about every single meetup in this area, so he's a great resource, right, Patrick?
So I want to be respectful of people's time. It is 9 o'clock, but as long as
There were
people
some
want to
other
stick
people over
around,
here.
then
This guy wanted to.
yep. There's.
If I could focus the last comment into a question. So you want to work in place, you've found a company you want to work for, and they're averse to hiring a remote worker. What strategy, what interaction might ease them into accepting you, and what kind of support might we give to both that potential employer and employee that would help that situation?
Start off with a temporary contract, 1 month to 3 months. It's so easy. If it doesn't work, you'll know.
Yeah, because for an individual, it is pioneering to be the first one in an organization. You are the proof of concept, like it or not. You have to prove to the business that it can work. But the other thing is that you're sort of deciding, is this organization going to be receptive to this or not? Because I don't want to work there. If not, it's not a viable option. But I do want to say, in terms of the summit, the goal of the summit is to try to help answer these questions long term. It's to get organizations together with cities and regions and states who are interested in promoting these kinds of arrangements, and to have the conversation between multi-parties about how we can support each other. What are the emergent best practices? Because we know that many organizations have got this down. They've got it right. And there are other organizations that sort of attempt to do it and pull back. Everybody knows Yahoo, right? A year ago, Marissa Mayer said, hey, all you remote workers, come in the office or you're done, which is not a great retention strategy for good people. But they couldn't figure out how to make it work. And so one person becomes the proof of concept for why remote work doesn't work, and organizations shut down those sorts of arrangements. So that conversation hasn't happened at a national level, believe it or not, ever before.
Right.
So we have a big opportunity.
And there's a cultural change that has to happen. I mean, you might be with well, you said it's about finding the right fit, because you might work with a manager. And I think you mentioned this. You know, if you see someone in a cubicle, you assume they're productive. But if they are at their desk at home, 2,000 miles away, that manager might have just worst case scenario on their mind and just never think that person's really doing a lot of work. And I mean, how do you change that manager's perception is something that you don't necessarily have control over. I mean, you can do your best to try to convince them and prove that you are, but so it's like a cultural shift has to happen.
So just a side note, there is technology out there where I'm serious, we're learning this in this process, that there's technology out there where there are these screens where people are watching each other. Boise, Idaho, and Portland, Maine are connected through these screens, and it literally is hey, like Bob in Boise is going to the water cooler and Sally in Portland is, passing by the water cooler in her location, and they can see each other through the screens, and they can reach out and say, oh, Bob, I wanted to talk to you about that.
Well, you mean there's screens at the water coolers?
Yeah, or near, there's wherever, there's potentially.
But the idea,
that would be cool.
But
yes.
The idea is there's not like a camera over your desk and it's like Big Brother. It's
Right.
like,
No.
There's like screens.
There's screens around the office, and
cool.
so it's intentionally through technology trying to provide those people an
those-
opportunity to have spontaneous
Right.
connections with one another. I just learned that. I think
That's
that's
very
fascinating.
cool. That's very cool.
You were gonna
Yes.
say something?
Hi.
And then we'll get to you.
I was just curious if it would be. I know I've worked for 3 different companies in the last 10 years, and all of them remotely. And incidentally, they found me through LinkedIn, so that's a great resource. At any rate, every one of them has to get the special tax forms, in order to pay the Maine state tax. And I've always just taken it for granted that, here's a headquarter or a company that obviously is not in Maine who has to fill out this form. Isn't there a way for us to get a count of who's doing that just from that database? I mean, it seems like...
Ryan.
I have inquired with the Department of Revenue, and there hasn't been a lot of, there's obviously, it's confidential data, obviously, but I know at the national level, which was one place, the IRS, I had spoken with them. They do not. It's very difficult to identify both parties because companies are only required to report from a main office, I believe it was, or their headquarters, but. That is something we're investigating within for the state to see if that's something that we can get a handle on. But
sure. Okay.
Hi. I've been pretty struck by a number of the different comments here in particular. So Elliot mentioning that it's really hard to kind of get young people started. Misty saying, we're a lot of mid-career professionals who are doing this. We've learned how to work, and now we're learning how to work remotely or in place. I wonder, there's a lot of opportunities to train managers or kind of concepts there. What can we do in the education field in our high schools where we're training kids on 21st century learning skills? How do we fit in this kind of concept? How do you work by yourself? How do you work remotely? How do you keep yourself on task? All of those kind of skills. How do we work that into that type of curriculum, the technology element of education, so that we can prepare people, especially here in Maine, where we want to keep people here in our state, so we can get them excited about staying here and feeling like that is an opportunity and not feeling like, okay, I need to learn how to work before I learn how to work at home or work in a co-working space?
It's a good question. Who wants to tackle it?
So one thing that I end up having to coach a lot of people on when they first transition to working on a distributed team is I should never have to ask you for status. And I think in a more traditional learning environment or work environment, we're accustomed to more hierarchical reporting, where you are asked for status or you show up at a reporting meeting or something like that. In a distributed team, it needs to be much more broadcast or radiating at all times, right? So one of the things I do with these chat rooms is like all of our things that happen. Like when I show up in the morning, I say good morning in the chat room. When I leave, I say I'm going to lunch. And it's not about being tied that I'm nailed to my desk. It's about just telling other people that I'm there. And like when I check in revisions to a document, that those get announced in the chat room. And the thing that I would most want a teenager to learn right now would be how to do a good job. Someone said shine the spotlight on yourselves, reporting on your accomplishments, right? Like to actually put the most important thing in the first sentence and then have a paragraph describing like, here's what I got done this morning, here's where I'm stuck, and I need X, Y, and Z. And just to be able to report on that stuff makes all of the difference.
Yeah, there's a whole culture of structure stuff, of sort of internal structures that you can create and you can put out there. Certainly status reporting. How do you structure a conference call where you're not face to face? Because I spend 6 or 7 hours a day on conference calls with people. How do you do that such that you build rapport with people, with clients, with coworkers, with a mixed group? How do you get things back on track if they're not going well? How do you make yourself visible? These are all teachable skills, but they're not things that in a traditional work environment have had to be taught. They're either sort of picked up over time, or they just don't happen, and it's sort of fine because people are face to face. It's a great question, Andrea.
Tackle it in the summit more, right? So,
hi, and just to build off of that, I think something that we can encourage in the youth of this country overall, just not in Maine. I think with social media, the youth of this country, they are putting themselves out there, experts. They know how to communicate to a broad audience. And I think once we get into a traditional workforce, that is stifled, that's shut down. That says, no, you can't look at Facebook when you're at work. You're at work. You're working with your group here in this office. So I think if we maybe look at what young people are doing well now and encourage that, you're setting them up to be the best in-place workers, possible. So
I had a team that had all of their meetings in Second Life.
There you go.
Do you guys
Seriously.
know what Second Life is?
This is like
It's
this
basically a
video
video
game thing.
It's a virtual world where you have a body and you make your own body and you move around and you build things.
You build things, right?
So you and your coworkers can be building something virtually and literally.
You could also be selling things virtually. I mean,
Yeah.
there's been millionaires made on Second Life, right?
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's real geeky
Well,
and awesome.
Okay, last question.
Well, it's more a comment. I think one important thing we're talking about communicating. When we're communicating electronically, it's very important to be conscious of how you communicate. A lot of times people tend to be very terse in their electronic communications. It's easier. Typing's a pain in the neck. Okay. But please, thank you, phrasing things in a friendly manner go a long way to building the team and keeping the team together and keeping hostility from arising within the team.
Sure.
This is why middle managers are so important, because they set the cultural frame for everyone else. They set the tone.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. Thank you very much to the panel. I think it was a fruitful conversation and certainly one that we could spend several more minutes talking about. But there'll be other forums and it'll be an ongoing conversation. So.
Can I just wait one thing?
Oh,
just because
yes,
I'm
of
just
course.
suspecting that some of you might want to stay on top of what we're doing in this field.
Sure.
And so we do have workinplacesummit.org, and we already have information, contact information, or no, I guess we don't have contact information, but a lot of these concepts about the summit are already up there. We're in the very early stages. We're trying to nail down a couple of national billion-dollar companies to help sponsor this, because right now it's a bunch of volunteers trying to get this going. I'm saying that because the caveat is the website has some basic information, but if you want to stay in touch with what we're doing, check that out on a regular basis. That will be the most updated information on what all of us are working on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.